Your hand shakes as you reach across the nightstand. The small glass bottle clinks against the porcelain saucer, a sound sharp enough to cut through the muffled ticking of the clock on the mantel. You steady it with your thumb, though the tremor never stops. The curtains are drawn tight, choking out the pale London daylight, but not the smell of soot that creeps in through the cracks. The air in the room is thick with damp wool and the faint sweetness of spilled medicine that has soaked into the wood. You uncork the vial, and at once the sharp tang of alcohol mixed with the earthy bitterness of poppy rises to meet you. Your throat tightens, not from disgust, but from longing. The dark red-brown liquid trembles at the lip, catching the dim glow of the lamp. It promises silence for the ache in your bones, stillness for the swarm of thoughts clawing at your skull. A sip, only a sip, and the world will soften again. Outside, carriage wheels rattle over cobblestones, muffled by fog. Somewhere down the street, a hawker calls out the price of bread. The world goes on without you, brisk and busy, while you sit hidden behind velvet curtains in your nightdress at noon. Your skin prickles with sweat beneath lace cuffs, and you feel the judgment of the housemaid who knocked not 10 minutes ago, her eyes lingering too long on the brown stain of the bottle cap. She knows. They all know. You pull the glass closer. The liquid quivers, threatening to spill, and for a brief instant, you see your reflection in its surface, hollow-eyed and pale, lips pressed tight as if bracing for confession. Then the moment is gone. Your fingers tighten, and you tilt it, the bitter taste biting at your tongue before it even spills past your lips. Warmth spreads through your chest, slow and heavy, like velvet weights pressing you into the chair. The shaking eases, your breath steadies, the bottle glimmers again, and you realize you cannot remember how much is gone already. Half, perhaps more. Time blurs inside this room. Days merge into nights, mornings into afternoons, as if London itself exists on the other side of a veil you can no longer pierce. Yet even as the warmth settles into your veins, a cold thought coils at the edges of your mind. How many more mornings until the dose no longer calms you? How many more nights until the bottle itself betrays you? The vial tips again. This time your hand does not stop it. In Victorian England, laudanum was not a vice, but a household staple. Every apothecary stocked it, every grocer kept it behind the counter, and many respectable homes stored a vial in the same cabinet as flour, sugar, and salt. For a few pence, one could purchase enough to dull pain, quiet a cough, or hush the endless crying of a child. It was a medicine that wore the mask of virtue, even as it carried the seed of ruin. Unlike gin, which had earned the slur of mother's ruin during the previous century, laudanum was wrapped in an aura of medical respectability. A woman could never respectably drink in public, but she could consume laudanum without a whisper of scandal. Doctors prescribed it freely, scribbling notes for headaches, menstrual cramps, toothaches, diarrhea, and nervous disorders. It was considered cleaner, more genteel, and far more acceptable than any intoxicating drink. Pharmacies did not dispense it sparingly. Bottles came in all sizes. From tiny vials, a lady might slip discreetly into her reticule, to larger flasks that might be set out on a dining table when guests complained of indigestion. Recipes varied, but most combined opium with alcohol, producing a dark, bitter liquid, strong enough to fell a horse. That did not stop physicians from recommending it as a cure for almost everything. To a population with little medical understanding, laudanum seemed miraculous. Respectability made it dangerous. While a working-class man found shame in staggering drunk through the streets, a society woman could sip laudanum from a glass at midday without tarnishing her name. What one could not do openly with whiskey could be done with medicine. The difference was perception, not effect. Behind closed doors, many grew dependent, dosing themselves not just for pain but for the melancholy, the restlessness, the endless boredom of a life contained within drawing rooms and parlours. The addiction crept slowly. At first, a drop for sleeplessness, then 2 drops for cramps, then a full spoon for grief that refused to lift. Physicians, seeing patients return with renewed complaints, often increased the dose. Some even boasted that laudanum steadied women's nerves and kept them pliant. The line between treatment and submission blurred. What made laudanum so insidious was its omnipresence. It was not the secret vice of back-alley dens, but the perfectly respectable poison of London's middle-class homes. Mothers poured it into cordial bottles. Gentlemen carried it in their pockets. Ladies kept it beside the sewing kit. It was everywhere, and because it was everywhere, no one thought to fear it. Behind lace curtains and gilt-framed portraits, the Laudanum Lady emerged. She was not a creature of back alleys or taverns, but of polished drawing rooms and private parlours. Her life outwardly appeared refined, shaped by etiquette manuals and afternoon teas. Yet beneath the veneer of gentility, a bottle lay hidden in a bedside drawer or slipped into a sewing basket. In Victorian society, where female respectability mattered more than almost anything else, laudanum gave women a secret escape. Doctors called it a cure for female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis that covered depression, anxiety, exhaustion, or simply the frustration of being trapped within rigid domestic roles. A woman who complained of sleeplessness might be handed a vial. A mother crushed beneath grief after the death of an infant might be told to take spoonfuls daily. Even those who sought relief from ordinary aches, headaches, cramps, or the burden of endless housework found themselves drawn into its grip. What began as a treatment quickly became a ritual. The Laudanum Lady became a familiar figure in literature and gossip, though rarely spoken of directly. Some appeared in medical records described as delicate or otherworldly, their pale faces and slow movements interpreted as feminine fragility rather than drug dependency. Neighbours whispered when a woman withdrew too often from social visits, when she grew gaunt or trembled as she poured her tea. Yet gossip remained muted, for it was easier to call her nerves weak than to admit she was an addict. Society often romanticised her decline. Painters depicted ethereal women reclining on fainting couches, draped in silks, eyes half closed, as though caught in some dream state. To men, such imagery represented fragile beauty. To women, it masked the truth of constipation, nausea, and cravings that worsened each week. Addiction was wrapped in ribbons and lace, as if prettiness could excuse suffering. What made these women's plight more tragic was how thoroughly they trusted the system that betrayed them. The physician who prescribed more drops, the husband who nodded approval, glad his wife was quieter now, the maid who discreetly refilled the glass, knowing better than to question her mistress. Their dependency was not rebellion, but compliance, born from following the very rules society had written for them. Yet behind closed doors, they knew every trembling hand, every long night, staring at the ceiling, until the medicine dulled the racing thoughts. Every morning when the first act was to reach for the bottle before breakfast, these were not signs of fragility, but of captivity. The Laudanum Lady was both respectable and ruined, hidden and visible, an emblem of Victorian contradiction. If laudanum softened the loneliness of drawing rooms, it also filled the cramped kitchens and soot-blackened rooms of London's poorer districts. Here, the medicine was not a luxury, but a necessity, measured out in teaspoons that kept hunger, exhaustion, and grief at bay. For the working-class mother who faced endless shifts at the factory or laundry, laudanum was a means to quiet her crying child long enough to wash another floor or mend another coat. Patent remedies with soothing names circulated through the streets, advertised in handbills, and sold by grocers who knew their customers well. Godfrey's Cordial, Mother's Friend. These tonics promised peace in a bottle. each one laced with generous doses of opium. Infants who wailed from empty stomachs or teething pains fell into sudden silence after a spoonful. The quiet must have seemed like a miracle to mothers whose nerves had frayed thin from sleepless nights. Yet that quiet often masked malnourishment, slowed growth, and even death. Working-class men also turned to laudanum, though less for nerves than for injury. Cuts from factory machines, chest infections from coal dust. The ceaseless aches of bodies pushed past endurance. Laudanum dulled them all. It cost less than brandy, did not reek of drunkenness, and could be purchased openly without shame. A man might stumble home from the gin shop and face ridicule, but a man who kept laudanum in his pocket was considered practical. In these households, laudanum seeped into daily life. A spoonful stirred into weak tea before bed, a dash swallowed with bread before work. The lines between medicine and poison blurred even more than in respectable society homes. For here the drug was survival itself. When wages failed to meet the cost of food, laudanum offered the illusion of fullness, tricking the body into stillness, while hunger remained unsatisfied. Medical officers of the time recorded their unease, noting the number of infant deaths tied to overdoses of soothing syrups, or the pale appearances of children fed too frequently on opiate cordials. Yet regulation came slowly, hindered by the sheer demand. To remove laudanum from the hands of the poor meant leaving them without recourse against their daily miseries. Historians still debate whether these families had any choice at all. The image of the Laudanum Lady, fading in her parlour, has long captured the imagination. But the reality in London's back streets was harsher. Addiction was not wrapped in lace, but in hunger and soot. For many, laudanum was less an escape than a last thread of survival, one that frayed too easily in the hands of the desperate. In candlelit studies and cluttered writing rooms, laudanum found another audience. Not the weary mother or the respectable housewife, but the poet and the philosopher. Among men of letters, the opium tincture carried a strange aura, part muse, part curse. Samuel Taylor Coleridge drank deep from its glass neck, chasing visions that spilled into verse, only to spend the rest of his life wrestling with dependency. Thomas de Quincey made laudanum infamous with his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, describing nights of soaring dreams and mornings of gnawing despair. For the literary world, laudanum became both tool and torment. Writers spoke of it as a gateway to heightened imagination, a window into realms unseen. De Quincey painted it with grandeur, describing visions of palaces and infinite spaces, as though the drug could lift a man out of the ordinary into something divine. Yet behind his florid words lay suffering, stomach cramps, trembling fits, and a body worn down by years of dependence. Readers, fascinated by his accounts, sometimes mistook his misery for romance. Men could confess their laudanum use in print and still retain a measure of dignity. Some were admired, even pitied as tortured geniuses, sacrificing themselves at the altar of art. Women, however, were not granted the same courtesy. A woman with a bottle was rarely called inspired. She was called fragile, nervous, or weak. The same substance that made men visionaries reduced women to invalids. It was a double standard that shaped both medicine and literature, leaving female voices largely silent on the subject. Yet traces remain. Letters, medical notes, and diaries speak of women quietly tethered to their bottles, their struggles never immortalized in memoirs or essays. A poetess might whisper her pain into private journals, while her male counterpart could proclaim it from a stage. Laudanum widened the gulf between the genders, offering men a cloak of tragic brilliance and women only the veil of shame. Still, the connection between laudanum and creativity lingered. Some believed the haze lent words a softness, as though the tincture seeped into the rhythm of sentences themselves. Others argued it dulled far more than it inspired, turning bright ideas into heavy fog. The debate continues among scholars even now. a reminder that the line between art and affliction is never as clean as legend makes it seem. For the poets and philosophers, laudanum was a tool that both gave and took. For the women in their parlours, it was no less consuming, but no one asked them to write about it. Their silence became part of the story. Behind the delicate embroidery of lace curtains, the symptoms of laudanum dependency unfolded slowly, often unnoticed by those who did not wish to see. The first signs were subtle. A woman who once bustled through her parlour now lingered too long in her chair. Her complexion grew pale, almost translucent, the bloom of her cheeks fading into a ghostly pallor. Friends whispered of her delicacy, as though weakness were a charm rather than a warning. The drug's toll on the body was relentless. Constipation plagued long-term users, a fact often omitted in polite conversation, but recorded in the journals of physicians who could not ignore the steady stream of complaints. Tremors crept into fingers that once stitched embroidery with precision. Appetite diminished, leaving figures gaunt beneath expensive dresses. Nights brought vivid dreams that could tip into hallucinations, some terrifying, others so alluring that patients chased them with ever larger doses. Doctors noted these symptoms, but rarely pointed the finger at laudanum itself. Many had prescribed the very doses that caused the decline, and to accuse the medicine would be to accuse themselves. Instead, they described their patients as suffering from nervous exhaustion or feminine weakness. The bottle remained on the nightstand, its cork worn from constant use, while physicians continued to refill prescriptions without hesitation. Family members often looked the other way. A husband returning from his office found a wife, too listless to argue, and considered it peace. A daughter who had once been spirited grew docile, and her quietness was praised as refinement. Laudanum dulled tempers, softened edges, and masked grief, making households easier to manage. The hidden cost was a gradual erasure of vitality, traded for a calm that came only through chemical submission. Visitors to such homes might glimpse the truth in small ways. A hand trembling as a teacup was raised, a cough that lingered longer than it should, a faint bitterness on the breath when a lady leaned close to speak. Yet society preferred to see fragility rather than addiction. To admit dependency would be to puncture the illusion of respectability that laudanum itself had made possible. In this way, the symptoms of laudanum addiction were transformed into social attributes. Pallor became elegance, silence became virtue, weakness became femininity. The drug did not merely alter the body, it reshaped how society defined womanhood itself. And in that reshaping, the true suffering of countless women disappeared behind the lace. Respectability was the armor that concealed the true devastation of laudanum. In a society that prized appearances above all else, what mattered was not whether a woman dulled her senses with opium, but how she did it. A lady with a bottle of gin risked scandal, her name whispered in drawing rooms as a moral failure. A lady with a vial of laudanum, however, was never accused of vice. She was merely following her physician's orders. This thin veneer of medical legitimacy allowed ruin to flourish quietly. Newspapers occasionally reported on cases of overdose, but the tone was hushed, often framing the tragedy as a miscalculation rather than a symptom of dependency. A young woman might be found unresponsive in her bed, her heart slowed by too much tincture, yet the death would be noted as accidental or unfortunate, never as the result of a wider problem. To acknowledge an epidemic would have been to confront the hypocrisy of a society that both sold and sanctified the poison. Within families, silence was often the chosen response. Husbands were reluctant to expose their wives, for to admit her weakness was to invite judgment upon the household. Mothers concealed their daughters' habits, fearful that whispers would damage marriage prospects. Servants, though quick to notice their mistress's fading energy or increasing reliance on the nightstand vial, knew better than to comment aloud. Respectability demanded discretion, and discretion preserved destruction. What made this cycle even more insidious was how laudanum reshaped behavior in ways that society perversely valued. A wife, who once displayed bouts of temper, now sat quietly, her nerves subdued by the tincture. A grieving widow who could not rise from her bed was soothed into motion again with drops in her tea. Physicians praised their own prescriptions as successes, never acknowledging that they were tightening the very chains of addiction. Ruin was rarely loud. It did not roar through London's streets as gin once had, with staggering drunks and public disorder. Instead, it whispered through parlours and bedrooms, a private undoing hidden behind velvet drapes. Respectability cloaked the addict in silence, but that same silence ensured she was left without help. In this way, laudanum became the perfect Victorian contradiction. It was both medicine and menace, respectable and ruinous, tolerated in drawing rooms, yet fatal in bedrooms. It allowed women to remain outwardly proper, even as it hollowed them from within. And because it fit so neatly within the expectations of female fragility, it destroyed without ever disturbing the illusion of decorum. By the middle of the 19th century, laudanum was not just a household remedy, but a national habit. Britain's relationship with opium stretched far beyond the apothecary shelves of London. Shipments arrived from India in staggering quantities, processed into tinctures that flowed into towns, villages, and city slums alike. The empire itself fed the supply, turning a colonial trade into a domestic dependency. Records show that bottles of laudanum outsold beer in certain regions, a statistic rarely acknowledged in public, but quietly noted in medical reports. The tincture's reach was astonishing. Clergymen used it for insomnia. Seamstresses took it for aching backs after endless hours bent over their work. Children were dosed with it for colic. Even animals were given drops to quiet their suffering. In every corner of society, the dark liquid was present, and yet the scale of its consumption remained obscured by the mask of respectability. Some historians argue that Britain lived through an opium epidemic every bit as devastating as the one it would later condemn in China. Others suggest the reality was more subtle, that laudanum was woven so tightly into the fabric of Victorian life that it became invisible. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Death certificates occasionally listed overdose or nervous collapse, but many more cases slipped by under gentler terms. Families preferred euphemism. Doctors avoided self-criticism. Society at large looked away. Medical journals of the time began to publish uneasy debates. Should laudanum be restricted? Could it be harmful in high doses? Was dependency a moral failing or a medical condition? For every article raising alarm, another defended the tincture as indispensable. Without it, doctors claimed, patients would have nothing to relieve pain or soothe grief. The discussion mirrored a society unwilling to confront how deeply it had bound itself to the drug. Meanwhile, the addiction grew. Parish reports spoke of children who appeared listless and pale, mothers too dependent to work, and factory men unable to last a shift without their spoonful. Yet these warnings rarely sparked reform. Laudanum was too cheap, too accessible, and too entangled with daily survival to be easily removed. In this way, the epidemic stayed hidden in plain sight. London's streets bustled, its empire expanded, and behind closed doors, bottles drained quietly. The very ubiquity of laudanum made it invisible. It was not a scandal, not a public nuisance, but a slow undoing that passed as ordinary life. By the late Victorian period, the silence surrounding laudanum began to fracture. Exposés appeared in newspapers, warning readers of overdoses and ruined lives hidden in genteel homes. Medical journals carried heated debates between physicians who admitted the dangers and those who defended the drug as irreplaceable. The very respectability that had once protected laudanum now made its risks impossible to ignore. Reformers began to call for regulation. Some argued that bottles should be labelled with warnings, others that sales should be restricted to licensed pharmacists. A few suggested outright prohibition, though such calls were quickly silenced by industry voices who profited from the steady demand. Laudanum was not only a medicine but a business, and businesses rarely surrendered profit willingly. Still, stories trickled into the public consciousness. A lady of good breeding found dead in her chambers, her laudanum bottle overturned beside the bed. A child in the East End succumbing after a mother miscalculated the cordial dose meant to quiet his cries. These accounts unsettled readers, forcing them to question whether the comfort they relied on was as benign as they wished to believe. Yet resistance was fierce. Many women clung to their bottles, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. The drug eased grief, dulled endless physical pain, and softened the edges of lives confined by rigid domestic expectations. To take away laudanum was not to free them, but to leave them without recourse. Physicians, too, often resisted reform. For doctors accustomed to prescribing laudanum as a universal remedy, admitting its dangers would be to admit their own complicity. The contradictions deepened. Respectable society condemned gin shops as dens of ruin, yet they still permitted the discreet use of opium tinctures in parlours. Critics railed against the Chinese opium trade, yet ignored the bottles lined up in their own kitchens. Even as reformers raised their voices, the hypocrisy of empire and industry weighed heavily against meaningful change. By the final decades of the 19th century, cracks had widened, but the curtain had not yet fallen. Britain was a nation dimly aware of its own dependency, but unwilling to act decisively. Laudanum continued to pour into cups and spoons, an intimate ritual that reformers could not easily pry away. Awareness had grown, yet the bottle still rested on the nightstand, its cork loosened by familiar hands. The story of laudanum did not end with sudden prohibition, but with a slow fading, as if the drug itself were slipping into the shadows it had long occupied. By the dawn of the 20th century, the pressure for regulation could no longer be ignored. The Pharmacy Act and subsequent restrictions began to place laudanum behind counters, its casual sale curbed by law. Yet these measures arrived too late for countless women who had already lived and died under its spell. Some overdosed quietly in their homes, their deaths recorded as accidents or illnesses. A vial tipped too far, a spoon measured too generously, a moment of despair met with a dose that numbed more than the nerves. The records rarely used the word addiction. Instead, coroners chose softer terms: exhaustion, debility, sudden failure of the heart. Respectability was maintained even in death, the true cause buried alongside the woman herself. Others endured long lives clouded by dependency, remembered by neighbours and relatives as delicate or unwell. They drifted through their days in a haze, still able to pour tea, still able to attend church, yet never fully present. Their decline was not marked by scandal, but by slow erasure. They became women half alive, tethered to their bottles until the very end. The withdrawal of laudanum from public life left behind silence. New medicines emerged, new regulations tightened control, and society moved on without recording the depth of its reliance. Historians now piece together fragments, newspaper clippings, death notices, diaries, and medical reports to reveal what was once hidden. These fragments point to a culture that depended heavily on a respectable poison, one that blurred the line between cure and curse. The irony is sharp. Britain waged wars abroad over the opium trade, presenting itself as a moral authority, while its own households consumed tinctures by the spoonful. Politicians condemned the sight of Chinese addicts in opium dens, yet ignored the pale women reclining in their own parlours, bottles resting discreetly on their nightstands. Empire, commerce, and hypocrisy intertwined, and laudanum slipped between them, unchallenged for far too long. The decline did not erase the damage. Generations bore its mark, not in loud scandals, but in whispered tragedies. Behind every obituary, softened by euphemism, lies the possibility of a life shaped and shortened by the tincture. Behind every painted portrait of a pale, delicate lady may stand the shadow of a bottle. Laudanum faded from common use, but its legacy remained, stitched into the hidden history of Victorian lives. Picture again the dim bedroom, the curtains drawn against the pale London daylight, a vial glimmering faintly on the nightstand. It is a small detail, almost unremarkable, yet it tells the story of thousands. A woman lifts the glass, her hand trembling, her face pale in the lamplight. To her, the liquid is not poison but peace. It is the only silence she can summon in a world that allows her little freedom, little comfort, and even less understanding. The Laudanum Lady was never meant to be a symbol. She was a wife, a mother, a daughter, someone who trusted doctors, obeyed prescriptions, and followed the rules written for her. Respectability was her shield, yet it also became her prison. Addiction slipped through that shield easily, draped in lace and velvet, until her life blurred into one long, opium-stained dream. When we look back at Victorian society, it is tempting to view these women as fragile figures, delicate and fainting. Yet behind the romantic image lies the harsher truth of suffering bodies, of minds caught between relief and ruin. Their silence was not softness, it was survival. Their fragility was not weakness, it was the mask that hid captivity. History remembers wars, inventions and monarchs with clarity, but these lives fade easily into the fog. No monuments mark them, no ledgers count them. Their stories linger only in fragments, whispered in coroner's notes or preserved in yellowed newspapers. Yet they existed in vast numbers, each with her own quiet struggle, each with her own small bottle. And perhaps the most haunting detail is how familiar it feels. The story of laudanum is not distant. It is a mirror. The same questions that haunted Victorian London echo in our own age. When does medicine heal, and when does it bind? When does society protect, and when does it turn away? The nightstand fades into darkness, the bottle empty, the curtains still drawn. What remains is the memory of countless women who lived and died in silence, their reality hidden behind the polite language of respectability. They were forgotten in their time, but they need not be forgotten now.